Year 10, just a quick video to just go over those exam questions, those consolidation questions, to make sure you're happy. Hopefully you had a go at them first and this is just sort of checking your answers, but if you weren't feeling confident, you could of course just go through this video alongside the questions and just make sure you understand them. So it starts off relatively straightforward, to be honest. Clearly the sheets got challenge questions on there, so if you are higher tier, you should be doing those challenge questions. If you're foundation tier, it's still good to have a look at them, even if you just, as I said, follow on the video. So nice and straightforward to start with, and everybody could be asked this on the exam. Which one of the following things is affected by cystic? If you remember back to your notes, it's cell membranes. And ultimately that's what causes the problems with the mucus that we sort of see when we look at the symptoms of cystic. The next question, again, tells you in the question here, so it's a foundation question, it does tell you that cystic is a recessive condition, which, if you remember from your notes, means it must be both versions of the allele, must be present in order to have the condition. And what it wants you to do is to explain how. So that's to basically give the detail of how two parents who don't have it can have a child who does. So if they don't have it, that must mean that they are what we call heterozygotes, and that must mean that they are, in the case of a genetic disease, carriers of that recessive allele, but they're healthy because they have that dominant one. Okay. Again, use a genetic diagram to support your answer. I would always say that's where we draw the noughts and crosses grid out as the easiest way to do one. Tried to colour code the answer here so you can see where all the marks are from. In this particular case, it's out of 3. So my first job was to put in my gametes into my table. So I did that in red. So you can see there's a heterozygote mother and a heterozygote father. Then I did my cross in blue. So again, there was a mark for that. So I got a mark for that. I got my correct cross. If you did do incorrect gametes, you can actually get a mark for so long as you've done the right cross. You wouldn't lose all your marks, but hopefully we got them correct. But then the most important thing is to actually then not just stop there, but to actually identify which one would actually have cystic fibrosis. And as you might remember from your notes, there's a 1 in 4 chance or 25% chance of them having the disease. So it's the homozygous recessive. So although they're healthy themselves, they can have a child with it. Then moving on to looking at a sort of low level screening question. Again, we introduced this last lesson as to why we screen, but the exam questions are not going to care about you knowing any detail about it. If they want that, they will provide it for you. What they're bothered about is that you can evaluate, and we'll talk a bit more about that later on. So that's in terms of the long answer questions, going to be more of a higher thing. But even on a foundation paper, they could, or a lower demand, higher tier question, they could ask you questions generally about why people do think we should screen and why people don't. In terms of why we do, why would we support screening? Clearly, if you support screening, then you're going to be able to know which embryos would have cystic fibrosis, and we can reduce the number of people with it. And it's not a nice disease, and it's got a low life expectancy and a lot of health problems associated with it. So we don't, if we can help reduce suffering, that's great. You could also have the argument that it does cost the NHS a lot of money to look after children, young people with this disease. In blue here are the other arguments that you could have. Again, it's about sort of giving that decision over to parents. The emotional argument of, it could allow you to not have a child with it. It gives you that choice. You could, as you'll see later on, you could have an abortion or help people to know they're going to have a child with CF, that they could be financially prepared for it. Conversely, why are people against screening? Again, you'll see in a bit more detail, and you'll do more about this in year 11 when we look at IVF. But actually, the whole extracting eggs from women and giving them various procedures and then making embryos in a dish, you could argue that that's potentially damaging or risky for the embryo or the baby. Screening itself is also quite expensive technique. Again, is that available on the NHS, or some people don't think that that's right? And again, of course, you've always got that moral argument, right to life. So a lot of people believe life begins at conception, and destroying embryos or that type of thing is not okay. So people believe in that. So either of those would be fine. Now, the next question is more of a challenge. If you're on a foundation tier, would be more of a challenge question. Higher tier need to be comfortable with these, but we've all had a look at these in the lesson. As always, remember you should be drawing on these family trees to help you work things out. So the first question is to give evidence from the diagram that this condition, which is not cystic fibrosis, this is an application question, but it tells you that it's caused by a recessive allele, which means it behaves in the same way as cystic fibrosis. So you can apply what you know about that. Remember, if it's recessive, you'd need to be a homozygote recessive in order to have the disease. So how come I know that? Well, I can see on the diagram here that this person has it, person 10 has it, so they must be that. And yet their parents don't have it, number 7 and 8 don't have it, so they must be that. I could also talk about this person here. This person has it, so they must have a dominant allele, but they don't have any children with it. But I would probably go for that one as my example. In terms of question 2, again, it's telling me that homozygous person 2 is homozygous for CRAM, but none of their children have it. So although they are that, I know they're homozygous recessive because they've got it, their children don't have it. So that tells me that those children must be all heterozygotes, because they can only get the little a off the mum, but the dad must have given them the dominant allele. So the dad has given them that dominant allele. He doesn't have it himself. He could be a heterozygote himself, they just haven't had a child, but with it, because it's only a probability, but it's likely that he is that person. You could show that on a Punnett square if you liked, just to kind of, if you said like explain why, you can explain it on a Punnett square, so long as you've got the correct genotypes present and you identify who's got what. And the last question, again, I would definitely be drawing a Punnett square for this. I'd always draw one just to kind of clarify, get it clear in my mind. Person 7 and 8 want to have another child. What is the probability that they will have CRAM, this recessive disease? Draw a genetic diagram to explain your answer. So as I said, we all already know that these guys are carriers because they have a child with it, but they're healthy themselves. So if I do my quick Punnett square, well, I say quick, I'm trying to do this on a laptop mouse, which is a bit awkward. I know my gamete possibilities because I know that my parents are heterozygotes, so I can draw that in. I then want to do, there'll be a mark for that. There'll be a mark for getting the cross correct. Big A, little a. Oh, I'm getting cramp in my hand. That one is little a, big A. Again, the letters don't matter, remember. I've just chosen an A because it's not ambiguous. I'm going to get a mark for doing my cross. I'm going to get a mark for identifying which one, I'll just draw that over here, which one would have it. So there's your CRAM sufferer, they would have CRAM. Forgot my C. They would have it, and the chance of that is a 25%, or you could have 1 in 4, or 1 in 4. So 1 in 4. So I have got all my marks. I got my gametes. I did my cross. I identified which one had CRAM, and I gave the probability, which is what the question wanted, for 4 marks. Lastly, a little bit on screen. I'm going to do lots on here because it's all on the PowerPoint. But in a nutshell, you're expected to be able to evaluate, to look, considering pros and cons, advantages, disadvantages, arguments for and against. It's about looking at information. It's a skill as opposed to a regurgitation of facts. They will give you information in the exam if it's a more complicated question, or as you saw earlier on, they could just ask you to give one example. This is a harder example. Again, it would be a challenge task for foundation. It probably would potentially even be a harder task for a higher tier, but both tiers could have evaluate questions on them, so we need to be okay with it. You do not need to know anything about this in terms of recall. This would be provided in the exam. Okay, if you look on your sheet, it's got some extra details about the two techniques, and we can then have a look at those. So the task was split. For foundation tier, you use the information, and I put some statements for you to highlight, just to help you think about which ones are arguments for screening and which ones are arguments against it. And I'm going to go over that in the next slide briefly. I'm going to attach this as well because the video is getting a bit long. If you did option 2, the challenge task, all it was really was to put that into sentences. And again, the mark scheme is on the end of this. I'm going to attach this PowerPoint for you on To Go for School so you can actually mark your work. But just to show you very quickly, this is the highlighting task, which would be for the lower demand one. And in blue, these are the arguments for. So, for example, it stops people from suffering, like we talked about before. It costs money to look after people who have these genetic disorders. So it could reduce healthcare costs. Those were things that we talked about before for the foundation question. Why shouldn't we do it? These are some of the interesting, if you look in the revision guide, talking about the idea that a genetic problem is undesirable. And that could increase prejudice, which isn't great. Again, what happens to the other embryos, destroying embryos? A lot of people think that's unethical. So I'm not going to talk you through them all. They're all on there. They're highlighted in the right colours. And as I said, if you did have a go at writing it out, there is a mark scheme for you to just double check against. So the information on the worksheet has got some key points. And for you to get all the marks, you have to talk about both sides, both conditions, arguments for and against. Okay, take care, year 10.